Good morning. I think we can still say good morning, right? Good morning, everybody. It's before lunch. And thank you for inviting me. Just one small clarification. The program says I'm from UNESCO, which I'm not. So I need to clarify that in case. I'm with the UN and I work with... yeah, that's okay. That's all right. No problem. I'm actually with the Department of Peacekeeping Operations right now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I think my bio says. So my presentation today will focus on laying the foundations of the development of a strategy or a broad-based strategic framework on migration, as the title suggests, with particular emphasis on the socio-economic and political aspects of migration. So just as an introduction, it starts with an explanation of why there is a need for a strategy, the importance of migration for city museums. This has been also belaboring the point in a sense. It's stating the obvious, but it's necessary to state it. It presents in a condensed manner a set of internationally accepted definitions of essential terms, what I call used and abused concepts. It summarizes a number of useful facts which could be used by city museums and statistics on migration more at the global level. It goes on to identify some challenges and myths which undermine a more balanced approach to migration, explores a number of thematic areas which are very broad, which can be considered by city museums, by CAMOC, summarizes the most relevant strategic frameworks, UN strategic frameworks, and then I will focus a little bit very briefly on the three most important UN organizations and what they're doing, those that are most relevant for city museums, and proposes an overall objective and a number of specific objectives which could be further explored and delved into. And finally, the next steps. So the idea of a strategy was a result of the discussions in Athens, which both Nicole and Joanna alluded to earlier, when it was acknowledged that individual initiatives were taken by most city museums on migration, but were very divergent in terms of methodology, scope, as well as terminology. So it was agreed that a more strategic common approach, including a set of shared objectives and a consensus on definitions, could strengthen cohesion and maximize the impact of city museums. In addition, we all know that the body of literature on urban refugees and migrant is growing exponentially, as well as the various policies, programs, actions dealing with migration. So there's a need to ensure a common understanding and knowledge base of the global socio-political situation regarding migration, especially given the escalating conflicts now in Syria, Yemen. There are conflicts all over the world, and the highly polarized debates on migration. So it's basically a more collective way of expressing what already individual museums are doing anyway. So I won't spend much time on that. Migration, of course, is becoming an overwhelmingly urban phenomenon because cities present more possibilities, of course, for employment and social development. So what we have now is over 3 billion people, or half of the world's population, living in urban areas, and half of those 3 billion live in slums. The world's migrants, including asylum seekers and refugees, have also moved to urban areas. and bring to the fore issues of citizenship, national identity, and cultural heritage. Nearly half of the total population of international migrants, or 122 million people, reside in 10 highly urbanized, high-income countries, and 5 of those are in Europe. Commonly used and abused concepts and definitions. Sorry. So there's currently a lot of confusion regarding the terms migrant and refugee. And the description of migrant is often used as an umbrella to cover both refugees and migrants. But the terms of refugee and migrant are not interchangeable. Refugees are specifically defined and protected under international law. To add to the confusion, there is no uniform definition of a migrant at the international level. But the UN defines an international migrant as a person who stays outside his or her country of origin for at least a year. So it's usually understood as someone who crosses a border in search of better economic opportunities. It's a voluntary process, motivated by the need to improve livelihoods. This is not the case for refugees who can't return to their country of origin and who are owed specific protections under international law. So equating the two terms could eventually undermine support provided to refugees and the institution of asylum. Within this broad spectrum of migration, there are different types of migrants. There are temporary migrants who are the guest workers, for instance, and who migrate for a limited period, and then they go back to their own country of origin. There are highly skilled migrants, ICT people, managers, executives, who move between countries within corporations. There are also a large part are irregular migrants, what people call in everyday language illegal migrants, but it's better to use the word irregular because illegal has criminal connotations, which is not the case. So the universally accepted definition of a refugee is contained in the first article of the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, and which defines as a refugee as someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside their country and cannot come back to their own country for fear of persecution. A few words about these conventions, which is very interesting. The 1951 convention was geographically limited, and it was exclusively aimed at post-World War II refugees. So in order to address this, to redress this, a 1967 protocol was introduced, which explicitly included those from outside Europe in the definition of refugee. Then there were other conventions added. In 1969, the Organization of African Unity extended the definition to include as a reason for refugee status external aggression, invasion, occupation, foreign domination, etc. And finally, in 1984, we have the Cartagena Declaration, which broadened the scope in a similar manner to include countries in Latin America. There are 3 essential elements for a person to be considered as a refugee. First, there must be a form of harm rising inflicted by either a government or groups or individuals. The person's fear must be well-founded and documented. And the third, the harm that is inflicted must be related to a person's race, nationality, religion, political opinion or membership in a particular group. The 1951 Convention and the 67 Protocol are basically the cornerstone of the modern refugee protection system, and they're based on three very important elements. The first element is non-discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or country of origin. The second one is the non-penalization in terms of illegal entry into a country or stay in an asylum country, and non-refoulement, which means no forced return or forced expulsion to a place where this person's life or freedom will be threatened. But there are serious, it's interesting because there are serious problems with this convention. It was written 60 years ago and has been widely criticized that now it's out of touch with with realities of the modern world. For example, the convention focuses on persecution by the state because it was written mainly to protect those who were being prosecuted by the Nazis. So during the Cold War, it was, the definition was also applied to those fleeing communism. Today, refugees tend to flee the general insecurity of conflict, usually internal conflict, civil war, rather than specific political persecution. In addition, the convention makes no mention of the environment or those who flee their country because of natural disasters, such as earthquakes and tsunamis. So already it's out of date. There is no legal basis to protect today refugees who seek asylum for environmental reasons. Furthermore, the convention doesn't explicitly cover people persecuted on their basis of their sexual orientation or gender. And the definition of a refugee has been interpreted primarily in the context of male asylum seekers. And often the claims of women asylum seekers differ from those of men, as women are often subjected to types of suffering, either unique to them, such as female genital mutilation, forced abortions, forced marriages, honor killings, domestic abuse. So there are now ongoing discussions on changing the convention and really making it reflect today's realities. Some facts and figures on migration. You will see in the middle, how do I do this? Here, there are over 244 million international migrants worldwide. So, and everyone, I think this is an ongoing thread in all the presentations, that migration is a constant feature of human history. And as we know, has supported the growth of the world economy, it has contributed to diversity and the enrichment of nations. But even though we're talking about 244 million, as a share of the world's population, international migration has remained pretty steady over the past decades, at around 3% of the worldwide movement. The US, Germany, and the Russian Federation are the most popular destination countries in absolute terms, followed by the UK, Australia, France, Canada, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Yes. Next, women make up 48% of international migrants globally, but they make up the majority of international migrants in Europe, with over 51%, and North America. There are more than 22 million refugees recorded in 2017. But what is also interesting to note is that the majority of this type of migration occurred within broader areas, within, let's say, Africa, or within Asia, and not between continents. We are led to believe, with the crisis in Europe, the so-called crisis in Europe, that everybody wants to go to Europe. That's not really the case. So to give you an idea of where the world's displaced people are being hosted, as you can see, we have 30, if we combine these two, it's 56% in Africa and the Middle East and North Africa, of course. 55% of refugees worldwide come from 3 countries: South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Syria. Only Syria is 5.5 million. And one interesting thing to keep, to keep in mind is that the top hosting countries, the vast majority of refugees, continue to be hosted by developing countries and not developed countries. So we have Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Uganda, which recently saw an influx last year of hundreds of thousands of refugees from South Sudan, and Ethiopia. So again, if we compare those numbers to what is happening in Europe, it's really not that substantial as opposed to what's the plight of the developing countries. Now, in the context of global migration, I think it's important to also take into account the internally displaced people, or IDPs. Although they don't conform, strictly speaking, to the definition of a migrant, since they don't cross an international border, internal displacement is very often the first step towards crossing a boundary and becoming a refugee or an asylum seeker or an international migrant. By the end of 2017, there were more than 40 million IDPs, which is more than double the number of refugees in the world. So it's no coincidence that 4 of the 10 countries that produced the most refugees in 2017 were also among the 10 with the largest number of IDPs. So despite its global scale, the issue of internal displacement remains largely overshadowed, especially with the current global focus on public attention on refugees and migrants. And then, last but not least, we have 10 million stateless persons. Statelessness may occur for a number of reasons, including a discrimination against particular ethnic or religious groups, or on the basis of gender, the emergence of new states, or the transfers between existing states. It's often the product of policies that aim to exclude people who are considered to be outsiders, and we have a glaring example of what happened last year in Myanmar, for instance, with in Rakhine State, more than 1 million people are stateless on the basis of their of the current citizenship law in Myanmar. Their statelessness can also occur where fathers are unknown, deceased, or missing, because there are 27 countries in the world now which don't allow women to transfer citizenship to their offspring, to their children, if there are no so-called heads of the family. So these are interesting information that is not widely known, but is interesting to retain. Now, challenges, perceptions, and myths associated with migration, a little bit on that need to be addressed. Stating the obvious, we've talked about this, the growing xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's assumed that it's really worldwide, but it's not. There was a study, an IOM, the International Organization of Migration survey, entitled How the World Views Migration, conducted across 140 countries, where public opinion towards migration globally is much more favorable than commonly perceived, with the exception of Europe. So, yes. The perception of a close connection between migration and terrorism, and I think Emma touched on that from a slightly different angle. And this targets more specifically irregular migration, which is increasing and which is regarded as a threat to national security. The common argument is that irregular migration and asylum may provide channels for potential terrorists to enter countries. The myth that irregular migration threatens national identity. The implication is that countries are at risk of being overwhelmed by enormous numbers of irregular migrants who undermine the so-called democratic values of Western societies. The rise of populism, need I say something more of this? We're quite a few examples: Austria, Italy, Hungary. Immigrants provide a convenient explanation for the ills of modern society. And far-right parties continue to draw support from large segments of the population, and so fuel anti-immigrant extremism. Going a bit quicker, the myths about the impact of migration on the economy. Again, a recurring fear is that migrants take away jobs from nationals, which is not true, because migrants are admitted to fill gaps specific gaps in the local labor market. So in reality, the impact on the economy is either, in the worst case scenario, neutral, no impact, or in the best case scenario, positive, in that it creates economic growth and generates more jobs. Human rights. There are many human rights violations. Migrants are subjected to arbitrary arrest, harassment, intimidation in both transit and destination countries. They're among the most vulnerable groups. They are at the mercy of the smuggling industry, and there's a lot that is written about that. They live on the margins of society, and they fill low-paying jobs, live in poor and squalid conditions, and they have often no or limited legal rights and limited access to education and healthcare. Women are often victims of trafficking, sexual and gender-based violence, and are among the most vulnerable in the labor market. The issue on integration, challenges of integration. This is really key because nothing has the potential to undermine migration policies more than a feeling of us and them, and the perception that migrants are taking away jobs from the local population. So integration requires a long-term vision and coordinated interventions in a number of areas, which I will not get into. And last but not least, the impact of government policies regarding migration. They have been characterized in many cases as ineffective, where there's a lack of political will and inertia on the part of governments to do something more action-oriented and more welcoming. There has also been lack of advanced planning, lack of solidarity amongst the EU countries, as we see, and the adoption of ad hoc restrictive policies. And it has been argued that the current crisis, especially in Europe, is not really a crisis. It's because the crisis has resulted from the manner in which the governments have responded. And one clear case is Greece, because I'm Greek and I follow the Greek developments quite closely. So one of the byproducts of emphasizing the crisis aspect of increased migrant flows has been the consequent assumption that Greece has had no past experience relevant to the scale of the current challenge, that they've suddenly been inundated by migrants. In fact, that's not the case. Since the 1990s, there have been almost 2 million migrants that have entered Greece and the educational system. So, having said all this, and taking into consideration the previous challenges, the evidence-based information, what are some possible thematic areas that could be considered by city museums? Of course, there's the theme of migration and urbanization, and the types of risks that the migrants are confronted with, including the threat of arrest, detention, deportation, exploitation. I mentioned it before. The growing so-called migration industry, and that is very interesting, both legal and illegal. So it's a business. That involves a variety of middlemen and enablers. We have lawyers, travel agents, immigration officials, local authorities, NGOs, international organizations, smugglers. So it's a whole chain of events which has developed. The increasing feminization of migration. The proportion of women among migrants is increasing rapidly, I mentioned earlier, and in 1915, nearly half of all the world's migrants were women, which is an interesting fact to note. Now, these changes can be attributed to a number of factors, including that women are migrating independently, whereas before they migrated with their husbands or relatives, etc. There's also a demand for foreign labor in developing countries, which is very gender specific. For example, in the entertainment business or in hospitality, healthcare, etc. Moving on to the types of migration we have already talked about. The economic impact of migration, so there are two aspects to highlight here. One is the demographics, and I think everybody is familiar with that. The argument goes that without labor migration, countries will be unable to sustain current levels of welfare policies and pensions. And so economists say that Europe needs to find 120 million additional people by 2040, and that is because of declining birth rates and increasing longevity. People live 20, 30, 40 years after retirement, and that there are fewer declining birth rates, there are fewer young people, meaning taxpayers, to support all this system. So migrants are crucial for urban economies in cities that have been reorganized, in global cities that have been reorganized around service industries, including finance and tourism. And another important economic consequence of migration is the whole issue of remittances. So the UN considers remittances as one of the most important contributions to development and the reduction of poverty. According to the World Bank statistics, it estimates that $586 billion were sent by international migrants to their families and to their countries of origin. So in developing countries, remittances are the most important source of external funding after corporate investments. So that's an interesting thing to note. In terms of the types of migration, I've already mentioned it, but it's interesting to note that temporary or circular migration, where people leave their country and return after a period of time, is also on the increase. Sometimes due to policies of destination countries adapting or adopting temporary migration programs. The drivers of migration So we know that the political situation in many countries is fragile, the rule of law is weak, there are lack of livelihood opportunities, particularly among the youth, which in many countries constitute a majority of the population. We have poor governance, instability, and these are major drivers of migration. So there's an urgent need to address the causes of irregular migration rather than the symptoms. Most people or most organizations address only the symptoms. And this can only be done by improving livelihoods and achieving development targets in countries of origin, so people have an incentive to stay rather than move to other countries. Migration and globalization. So the communications revolution is really a central element in the globalization process. Between 1990 and 2006, the number of internet users went up from 1 million to over 3 billion. That's an amazing number. And this is relevant for migration because it makes people aware of what life is like elsewhere through the internet. So they create real or imagined opportunities and reasons to leave. The role of local authorities, communities, and national governments in migration. There were a number of references to social contracts with communities. But I think it's important to highlight the linkages between the three, the communities, local authorities, and national governments. Because if we limit our focus only to one, it remains at the local level, or it remains at the community level. And we were talking earlier about access and power. Here's a very good example of why there's a need to link the three. Okay, trends and patterns, we've talked about this. International migration will continue to rise, and the internal migration will continue to rise within the next 2 years. There are two models, main models of integration, two competing models of integration. The first is assimilation, where immigrants are expected to give up their distinctive linguistic, cultural traditions and become part of the mainstream of the population. And France follows this model more or less. And the second is the promotion of multiculturalism, where people are encouraged to retain their language and their culture. In Canada is a prime example of this type of integration. Climate change, that's very much in the news. We have to make a distinction between slow onset climate change, like rising sea levels or desertification, and rapid onset climate change, like floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc. A consensus seems to be emerging that climate change is likely to drive more internal migration and internal displacement, which consequently may translate into more international migration. The dynamics of smuggling and trafficking, there's again a growing literature and awareness as more and more cases are coming to light, and the media is really starting to focus on the dynamics of smuggling. We all know the slave markets that came up in Libya, for instance. So there needs to be more focus and really at the root, get to the root of the smuggling business, not just treat the in-between passages. Societal changes as a result of migration. We know that migration has transformed societies and made them more diverse. But at the same time, this increasing diversity can present challenges and can lead to a lot of debate within countries. For instance, the headscarf controversy in France is one example. both the positive and negative aspects of diversity are very keenly felt in major cities, especially in global cities like New York, London, Paris, Hong Kong. Migration has become an integral part of the character of these cities. And their economies have become reliant on both highly skilled migration, let's not forget that. We're talking about executives, we're talking about managers, and also lower skilled jobs in transportation, construction. Finally, transnationalism, this has resulted in a new form of consciousness, as increasing numbers of migrants have dual or multiple identities. This is my case, and I'm sure this is the case of a lot of people in this room. So there is a new blend to the cultures and a hybrid cultures coming about. But this has been a common feature in every single age, in every single era of humanity, hybrid cultures. And last but not least, I'm going to spend some time talking about partnerships with UN organizations. I'm really going, I could talk for hours about this, but there are many strategic frameworks, conventions. The UN is really good at meetings, at producing resolutions, etc. But I will mention the three most important ones. There are the Sustainable Development Goals, everybody knows about that, which were adopted in 2015. There are a set of 17 goals, which are designed to end poverty, fight inequality, and address climate change by 2030. And they build on the Millennium Development Goals. Of particular relevance to museums and CAMOC are two SDGs. Number 10, which talks about facilitating orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people. And SDG 11, whose objective is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Okay, these are big words, but at least they're there. The second one is the new urban agenda, which was the result of the UN Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, which took place in Quito in Ecuador in October 2016, and which sets standards of achievement in sustainable urban development for the next 20 years. So that is also something very relevant to museums. And thirdly is the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. In September of 2016, the General Assembly adopted a set of commitments to enhance the protection of refugees and migrants, which is known as the New York Declaration. The important thing to retain from there is that it's a milestone because it addresses refugees and migrants together. So this is really a first in, and going from there, I will talk about and try to really make it focused on the three most important UN agencies which have a specific mandate for refugees or migrants. The first one is IOM. The thing to note about IOM is that it has three important websites which are open to the public, which could be a vital source of information for museum professionals. There's the Displaced Tracking Matrix, which monitors arrivals to Europe. The Missing Migrants, 5 minutes? Okay. Which is a World Wide Web, and the Global Migration Trends, which are annual fact sheets, which really produce statistics and figures on that. UNHCR, whose main role is to provide international protection to refugees and seek durable solutions. The thing to note about UNHCR, again, its shift, the acknowledgement that refugees are increasingly present in urban areas. So it has shifted the way it operates and has focused attention on cities and it developed a policy on refugee protection and solutions in urban areas. And last but not least, we have UNESCO. And UNESCO, through ICAR and ECAR, has launched a major initiative welcoming cities for refugees. I think everybody is familiar with that. The thing to note, as part of the preparation of this paper, I contacted UNESCO in Paris and shared with them the results of the Athens, the reports of the Athens workshop. And they showed a keen interest in CAMOC, the project on migration and arrival cities. And they told me that they really wanted to pursue closer collaboration, more focused collaboration with museums, and CAMOC in particular. So they suggested, as next steps, to have an initial meeting between UNESCO and CAMOC, the CAMOC Executive Committee, which could be organized to discuss how to further collaboration with UNESCO. So this is one thing that could be discussed. Can I have another 5 minutes? Very quickly. No, no, okay. So the overall objective, this is a proposal of an overall objective which would bring museums in a more collective manner, is to serve as positive change agents in addressing the socio-political, historical, and dimensions of migration. Of course, this is overly encompassing. It needs to be broken down into specific objectives. And here we are. There are many. As I said, this is the beginning of the strategic exercise, and for every specific objective, we have to develop results, activities, a resource base, a budget, and indicators, smart indicators to monitor progress. So this is an ongoing exercise. Very, very quickly, I think most of the museums, we'll find out in the next couple of days, are already doing that. Fostering cultural dialogue, promoting synergies, using their unique catalytic skills in order to foster inclusion, diversity, social cohesion, increase awareness of policies and actions in the field of migration, the knowledge of the current trends that I mentioned earlier, highlight best practices and positive contributions, and their last bit. Again, contribute to the understanding of global concepts, which I went into at the beginning. Deconstruct stereotypes, advocate again on the part of local and national authorities, highlight identity issues, and address negative attitudes, hostility. I think that is important towards migrants and communities. So, next steps, and I have nothing here on purpose because this is, again, this is part of a process, and it needs to be discussed with CAMOC on what the next steps should be. So it's up to you to decide what to do next. So I thank you very much.